Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Aaron Hall, and I am the Youth Outreach Chair of the League of Women Voters Greenwich Board. Together with my League Board colleagues, Deidre Kamlani and Catherine Lanier, we are delighted to welcome two esteemed constitutional scholars this evening, Professor Kermit Roosevelt III and Professor Akhil Reed Amar. Co-sponsoring this program today are the Greenwich Library, who we thank for the use of this wonderful community space, and Connecticut Public, our statewide PBS NPR affiliate. As you may know, League of Women Voters of Greenwich is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to empower voters. We envision a democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the ability to participate. That is why we are so pleased to be able to host this discussion about Professor Roosevelt's book, The Nation That Never Was. Professor Roosevelt challenges us with a fascinating notion, that we are not the nation of Jefferson's Declaration or Madison's Constitution in our values or beliefs currently, despite originalist claims to the contrary. Rather, that we are living in Lincoln's America, philosophically remade in the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address, and enshrined in the redefinition of citizenry in John Bingham's 14th Amendment, committed to liberty and equality. On the cusp of our presidential election season, what values inspire and animate us? Professor Kermit Roosevelt III is the Berger Professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Carey Law School and is a former clerk for Supreme Court Justice David Souter. He is the direct descendant of President Theodore Roosevelt and the grandson of Kermit Roosevelt, who worked under Presidents Truman and Eisenhower. Professor Roosevelt is a distinguished research fellow of the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania and a member of the American Law Institute. He has also authored fiction and nonfiction works, the latter including The Myth of Judicial Activism, Making Sense of Supreme Court Decisions. Moderating the discussion this evening is Professor Roosevelt's friend and mentor, Professor Akhil Reed Amar. Professor Amar is the Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University. He clerked for Judge and later Justice Stephen Breyer, and he joined the Yale faculty at the age of 26. His work has won awards from both the American Bar Association and the Federalist Society, and he has been cited by Supreme Court justices across the spectrum in more than 4 cases, tops among non-emeritus professors. He regularly testifies before Congress at the invitation of both parties. Professor Amar is a prolific author of more than 100 law review articles and several books. Most recently, The Words That Made Us, about America's constitutional conversation from 1760 to 1840. Born Equal, The Empire Strikes Back of the current trilogy, he will be completing by this 4th of July. On a personal note, I believe I speak for my fellow We the People, the Citizen and the Constitution civic educators across the country when I say that Professor Amar is on our Mount Rushmore of civic education scholars, with Professor Roosevelt ascending that mountain. Their scholarship provides our intellectual backbone. It is my deep honor to welcome them tonight as I look forward to more scholarship from my students as they stand on the shoulders of these constitutional giants. Tonight, our speakers will engage in a discussion together for about 40 minutes, after which they will take questions from the audience. We will have 2 volunteers stationed at either side of the auditorium with microphones. If you are called on, please wait until you get the microphone so your question can be heard. Please keep your questions brief and on topic so we can get to as many as possible. The program will end around 8:15, and we will invite everyone back to the lobby where Professors Roosevelt and Amar will be signing their books. And with that, please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Well, it's such an honor to be back here at the Greenwich Public Library and see you all and to welcome my dear friend and former student, Kim Roosevelt, back to the great state of Connecticut, where he did his law training. I think it's especially wonderful to be here with my dear friend, Aaron. And we're in the library. And I'm a book person. It's kind of the place where I discovered who I am. So I'll tell you some interesting things. I learned stuff about books all the time. You know, I thought I knew a lot. So I'm going to talk, Kim, just for a minute about a little trick that you and I probably know, that the subtitle of a book is actually very important, not just the title, because sometimes you use the subtitle to communicate really what a book is all about. So, for example, here's something I learned about books. See, I learned that this book, The Words That Made Us, it was originally going to be called America's Constitutional Conversation. I thought, 3 words. You know, that's really great. No. Okay, it's only 3 words, whereas The Words That Made Us is 5 words. Okay, so 3 is better than 5. No, because actually you want small words. Because they look better on a cover in some ways. And this is one of the very few books that you will ever see that's so fat, so thick, that the words actually are arrayed on the spine horizontally. There's almost no book that's true. And happily, my my last name is a short one as well. So I never understood that about books, and they're explaining to me that. So I talked to the designer or something like that. So, like, did you know? I mean, I didn't know that before. Okay.
No, I need to write thicker books.
So no. So the last book that I talked with Kim about, I was actually visiting my old boss, Judge Breyer. I was up at Harvard a couple of weeks ago, and I went into his office at Harvard, and the book that was on the shelf, there were a few others, but not that many, had, I think, a 1-word title.
Yes. No subtitle.
And the book is Allegiance, and it's Kim has written fiction and nonfiction. And I was telling Justice Breyer, I said, "Oh, like, have you read this book?" And he said, "No." But I said, "Oh, you really should." No. And he was when I told him what the book is all about, he was very engaged. So he's got his own book coming out this month. It's called "Reading the Constitution: and
Italics.
Yes, the subtitle, and there's italics. He didn't write it because he's not as edgy person. It says, "Why I chose pragmatism, not textualism." Okay, so he's picking a fight with Scalia in all of that. But the book is The Nation That Never Was. Okay, that's kind of soaring, and it has a certain. But I think the subtitle, it has a certain precision to it, and I want you to talk about all 3 words because all of them I think are important, and then I'll chime in. Reconstructing, that actually has a certain meaning, truth be told. It works on a couple of levels. America's, okay, story, okay? So what's that all about? Okay, The Nation That Never Was is somewhat poetic, but not that specific yet. But then you're saying something very specific, I think, with reconstructing America's story. And I could even imagine that was originally your title, and they said, "Oh, flip it around," or something, because my title was originally America's Constitutional Conversation, and they said, "No, the words are too long. The Words That Made Us is." So anyway, tell us about reconstructing America's story, and if you like, you can also tell us about The Nation That Never Was.
I would love to. Well, first, let me say thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Akhil, for agreeing to do this. Thank you to the organizers. It's really a delight to be here. So, reconstructing America's story. Well, my original title actually was America Again, same as the Langston Hughes poem. And then it was going to be something like Reconstructing the Nation That Never Was, sort of mixing them together. But then it turned out that Stephen Colbert had a book called America Again, Regaining the Greatness We Never Weren't, or something like that. And the publisher thought that I was too close to that and there would be confusion. So we ended up with The Nation That Never Was, Reconstructing America's Story. And you're right, I think the subtitle is definitely more precise in telling you what the book is about. So America's Story, I'll start with that. Nations, I think, need something that gives them a sense of identity and a sense of unity, because one of the things about being a member of a nation is you might be called upon to fight for that nation. You might be called upon to make sacrifices for that nation. So there should be something that makes you believe in your nation and believe it's good, believe it's worth sacrificing for. Believe that you are part of a community it's worth fighting to defend. And you can imagine different ways that different nations might do that, and some nations have done it through shared ethnicity or shared religion or shared origins of different sorts. But in America, we don't do that. In America, we're committed to ideals and values and principles, and the way that we express that commitment tends to be by telling a story. So we've got a sort of narrative identity for the American nation. And the story that we tell, which I'll give you briefly, and it should be familiar to you from political rhetoric, this is what presidents say all the time, this is what politicians usually talk about, is that America, we're certainly a good nation because we are dedicated to good values. We're dedicated to liberty and equality. And you know that because they're stated in our founding document, which is the Declaration of Independence, most notably in the phrase, all men are created equal. And then America is born in a war for liberty, and we fight in the Revolutionary War for these principles of liberty and equality. And then we make them part of our higher law in the Constitution that's written in 1787, which codifies these ideals of liberty and equality. And then, we struggle and sacrifice to make those ideals real over time as American history works forward. So that's America's story, as I understand it. That's sort of the conventional story that we tell ourselves to explain who we are. And I'm trying to reconstruct it. So the problem that I think America is facing now is that this story doesn't work for people as well as it used to. So for younger people in particular, I think they're saying, we've been told this sort of whitewashed, triumphalist version of American history. And we insist that you make it more accurate and look at the past with clear eyes and see what our founding really was like, warts and all. And then once you start doing that, I think people find that it's not as inspiring. And we could talk about Thomas Jefferson maybe in particular later, but younger people in particular, I think, are finding this story less inspiring, which means it's not going to do the work that it has been doing for us historically. So it's a story maybe in need of repair, but what I'm trying to offer instead is reconstruction. So we're going to build something different. We're going to take this story, and the amazing thing about the different story that I offer is it does have the same form. So it's got this founding document that states our ideals, and there's a war that's fought for those ideals, and then there's another document that makes those ideals into law. But different documents, different war. And I'm going to reconstruct the story, and this is where there's sort of the double meaning, by focusing on Reconstruction. So rather than saying the founding of America, the birth of America is the time that we now think of as the founding, so the 1770s, the 1780s, I say really actually if you look at the history, there's a much stronger case. So I think this is useful because it gives us a story that we can believe in. And I also think it's true if you look at the history. There's a much better case to be made that the birth of America is the Civil War and Reconstruction. So I'll tell you how my substitution works. My founding document, instead of the Declaration of Independence, it's the Gettysburg Address. The war that creates America, instead of the Revolution, it's the Civil War. And the Constitution that makes these ideals into law, it's not the Constitution that's written in 1787, it's the very different Constitution that you get when you add the Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. So I'm saying we can focus on Reconstruction, and we'll have a story that's both more accurate and more inspiring, because you can look at the heroes of Reconstruction and you don't have the same sort of problems that you have with, say, Thomas Jefferson.
So that last point, so different war, different document, and different constitutional provisions, 13, 14, 15. Gettysburg Address, more than the Declaration of Independence, Civil War, more than Revolutionary War. But you just said one more word, Kim. Heroes. A different hero. Now, with Reconstruction, we're going to have women as well as men. We're going to have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Harriet Beecher Stowe and others. But preeminently, we're going to have Lincoln and not Jefferson, even though Lincoln gives all the credit, brilliantly, cleverly, to Jefferson in a way, or at least he says all honor to Jefferson. I'm going to jump in at a certain point and say, the Declaration isn't just Jefferson's, but to hold off on that just a moment, because there are actually other people in the room. He did not dine alone in 1776. He wasn't the only person in the room where it happened. But hold that thought for just a minute, because my friend Aaron actually said something about Mount Rushmore, okay? And we've already talked, you see, and we can't not, because we're actually Americans. It's what we have in common. So we've mentioned Jefferson. Owen, we've mentioned now Abe Lincoln. I think the word Roosevelt did come up in our conversation, actually. And I did have this image when you talked about, climbing up to Mount Rushmore of like North by Northwest and Kim, somehow, crawling up Teddy's nose or something, just like Eve Marie Saint and Cary Grant in that amazing movie. But I digress. So we haven't yet said Washington, but he towers over everything. And here's the point, because we're going to disagree a little bit on some things. I think the Declaration is less uniquely Thomas Jefferson's and therefore has more redemptive possibilities. But he and I both agree that just rooting everything in the founding is a real problem because of, in one word, slavery. Okay? No matter how you slice it. And Reconstruction does end slavery with the 13th Amendment, which is a glorious thing. And so at the end, there are going to be some slight differences, but we need to reconstruct America's story based on Reconstruction. Yes, 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 and it's more true of who we are today. But let me just elaborate a little bit about why we have to have a story. And you do say, because, we have to fight wars, and what are we fighting about? And that's part of it. But you see, the other part is, if we don't actually have any sense of American identity, then who are we? Are we a people at all? Because and you started to talk about this. It's not only that we don't have race in common, we can't, actually, because we're multiracial, and we're not going back. Okay? We don't have religion in common. I'm not mocking them, there are many societies around the world that are organized around religion. Sharia law is the ultimate constitutional law, and it's rooted in Quran. And Israel has to decide whether it's going to be, secular or ultimately at the most fundamental level, a Jewish state. And what does that mean? Of course, because there are many ways of being Jewish. So we don't have race in common, and we can't. We don't have religion in common. Some Americans, our families came over hundreds of years ago. Some with bullwhips in their hands, some in chains. Some families came over yesterday. We don't truthfully even quite have language in common, and we don't have these cultural things to organize American identity. We don't quite have Shakespeare or Goethe. As I said, we don't have Quran or the Bible. We are Catholics and Protestants. Oh, even if it were the Bible, which Bible? King James or the Douay Bible, and which translation, and there are these other texts, and traditions, and lots of people who are not persons of, who are not, let's say, churchgoers. Of the four guys on Mount Rushmore, interestingly, two were not conventional churchgoers. I think, your great-great-great-grandfather was, but not Lincoln and not Jefferson, interestingly. So American identity has to be rooted in something else. Because it can't be religion, it can't be race, it can't be politics. We disagree, it's not geography. We're a vast continent, okay? So We have a story, and that's what we have in common as Americans. We have American history. What you and I have in common is George Washington. And I'm thinking the Roosevelts probably aren't even here in the era of Washington. Maybe the Dutch go all the way back? Okay.
Oh, yeah, the Dutch, the Roosevelts. Yeah.
Okay. So your people, as they would say.
My Lithuanian ancestors didn't get here until after Washington.
You know, we arrived in the 1950s. But you and I are Americans, and we're Americans because we actually have George Rushmore in common, George Washington. You even more than I in a certain way. But Lincoln says very famously in an address all about July 4th that immigrants can, if they choose to be, blood of the blood, flesh of the flesh of the American saga. That's what he believes. Okay, because it's a story, it's creedal. We can accept it or not. 7 years ago, our fathers, not literally, but figuratively, brought forth upon this continent a new nation, and it's about ideas conceived in liberty and dedicated to propositions. So there's certain these ideas. And so Lincoln says that, and he's trying to root it in the founding in certain ways, not just in the Constitution, but the Declaration and what's the relationship between these. But here's where your book comes in. You say, the story isn't quite true, one, and it's not quite inclusive, two. Those are two independent problems with the story, if I've read you correctly. And I think on those two basic things, I share your concerns. So say a little bit more now about heroes, for example, about Thomas Jefferson compared to Abraham Lincoln, and where does Washington fit in? And you don't even need, if you don't want to tell me where Roosevelt fits in all of that.
Well, I don't actually talk much about Roosevelt, but I'll explain the title now, actually, maybe, since that's one of the things that you were bringing up. So the nation that never was. What is that nation? That's the nation that we've been telling ourselves we were. So the nation that Lincoln is talking about, born in 1776, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
7 years ago is 84. You do the math. It's 1863, November 1863. The battle is in mid-July, early July, July 3rd, 4th. But he's saying this in November 1863. That's the Gettysburg Address. A score is 20, so 80, four score, that's 80. So 87, excuse me. So 1863 minus 87, do the math in your head. He's saying it's not 1787 with the Constitution, it's the Declaration. It's not quite we the people, it's dedicated that all men are created equal. So he's rooting the origin, the bringing forth of the nation in 1776. He's doing that in the first sentence. He's saying our fathers, as if we were all descended from them, which we're not. But he's trying to create. So he's saying 1776. Lincoln is.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Right. So he's counting back to 1776, and he's saying at that moment, the American nation was born. And he's doing that, I think, because he wants to invoke this idea of equality, because that's the moral basis that he's now resting the Civil War on. And why is he looking to the Declaration rather than the Constitution? Well, it's an interesting choice in some ways, I think. But I think the reason that he's doing that is that if you want to say that you're fighting for equality or you're fighting to end slavery, it's a tough sell to say, and I'm fighting in the name of the Constitution, written in 1787, because that Constitution protects and rewards slavery in various ways. So you've got the protection of the international slave trade until 1808, superseded by the time of the Civil War. You've got the Fugitive Slave Clause that forbids free states from declaring fugitives free and instead requires them to be returned. And you've got the Three-Fifths Compromise, which you very aptly called a pro-slavery gerrymander, which tilts every branch of the federal government in favor of slavery. So Lincoln is pointing to the Declaration instead because it's got this nice language about equality. And yet, I think it's maybe in some ways, if you think about it, an even tougher sell. So here's one of the somewhat surprising or unconventional things that I say in the book. Lincoln says he's fighting in the name of the Declaration of Independence. But what is he doing? Who is he fighting? He's fighting against people who have declared their independence. And why have they declared their independence? Because they think that they joined a union that made certain promises to them in the Constitution about slavery, which I just listed. And they think that the free states and the national government are not honoring those promises, so they're not getting what they were promised, what they were due when they signed up. They think that the government has become destructive of the ends for which it was created. The national government, one of the things that it was supposed to do was to protect their right to own slaves. And now they think a different form of government will better affect their safety and happiness. And in all of that, I think they're probably not wrong, because the national government has now fallen into the hands of the Republican Party, which wants to destroy the institution of slavery on which these Southern societies are built. And so I think the Southern secessionists have a very good argument that the Declaration of Independence supports them, that it's on their side. So this is one sort of strange thing that Lincoln is doing. And then sort of more directly related to the title, I would say there is no nation that is born in 1776. It's more something, well, technically I think in 1776, what you get is independent states, which is what the Declaration says. So the colonies take their place on the world stage as free and independent and equal states, able to do all things that states may have right do. So now they're relating to each other basically as foreign countries. And Lincoln says, actually in some ways the Union preceded the states. The states were never states outside the Union. It's interesting to compare this, I think, to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan famously says, we all need to be reminded that the states created the national government. The national government didn't create the states. So in some ways, I see Reagan as inverting Lincoln's vision. That's a slightly different topic. But just to go back to the question of nation. So Lincoln says that a nation was born. I say, first they're independent states, but then it's more like a league, right? Then you get the Articles of Confederation, then you get the 1787 Constitution, and even there, I would say the United States is plural. The United States is a collection of states, and it is, in fact, a plural noun in the Constitution. And when does a political party say the United States is a nation? I think if you go through the party platforms, the first time you find that, the first time I found it, there is a party that says the United States is a nation, not a league. And it's the Republican Party in 1876. So after the 14th Amendment, now I think we're an American nation. So I sometimes say, we like to tell ourselves America was an anti-slavery nation from the beginning. And I think that's sort of true. But I also think, we're not anti-slavery until 1863, and we're not a nation until 1868. So the idea that there was this anti-slavery nation in the 18th century, that's sort of what the title is about. That's the nation that never was.
So I think we disagree about some things on this, and we agree about other things, and you'll just have to read the books and decide for yourselves. I'm going to ask you, just while I'm bloviating for just a bit, but the question I'm going to ask you is, so what does this phrase, all men are created equal, mean? In the sequel book, the Two Towers or the Empire Strikes Back, whatever you want to call it, a chapter they recently completed, I actually come up with no fewer than 10 possible meanings for this, very resonant, but not exactly precise phrase, all men are created equal. So that's what I want you to think about. I know we're going to get questions soon enough. My own take would be the following. And that's the story told in this one. The words that made us, it's almost a pun. Us could be understood as U.S., and that's why there's a kind of a red and blue line underlining the U.S., how we become a we. So I agree with you that in 1776, we're 13 independent states with an S, plural, independent even of each other. We form an alliance. It's at best something like NATO or the EU that actually permits Brexit. And indeed, the Constitution itself, when you read it, some of the states are actually breaking away from other states. When George Washington swears his first oath of office, North Carolina is not in the new USA 2.0, and neither is Rhode Island. So you could say 11 states seceded from the other two, but they did it en masse. They didn't do it individually. They did it unitedly, and that does make a difference. And they did it for some legitimate reasons, because it was a treaty and no one was following the treaty. I do believe that they created an indivisible union for geostrategic war purposes in 1787-88. And once you're in, you're in. And not a single person ever said otherwise in an entire year of constitutional conversation. And if you find one leading Federalist who said, come on in, if you don't like it, you can leave, money back guarantee, you will get tenure, because no one has ever found such a person. So I don't love this idea that the secessionists in the 1860s had a legal leg to stand on. They didn't. They were not only evil, but they were traitors. Okay? That's actually my legal view. And there's a big fat book with a lot of evidence, for this. So don't love your friend, our friend Noah Feldman, sort of saying that kind of Lincoln maybe was wrong about that. So that's where we have the most disagreement. But
right. Although I should say, I'm not saying it's legal. Actually, you have convinced me on that. I do not think that is supported by the U.S. Constitution. Good. I think secession is supported by the Declaration of Independence. And George Washington is a traitor.
He is. He's a traitor to the Brits. Now, he's making an appeal. Let facts be submitted to a candid world. He's ultimately saying, legally, maybe we don't have a leg to stand on, but morally we do, because the King of England has done all these idiotic things. And that's actually what Lin Miranda captures with the idiotic King George III, who's utterly clueless, who's just not even listening to the Americans, da-da-da-da-da. At the end of the day, if they don't have a legal leg to stand on, the American revolutionaries, because they're breaking away from Britain, at least they have strong moral case. I don't believe that the folks in the 1860s had a good legal case for the reasons we've just identified. I don't think in the end they have a strong moral case, because it was all about slavery. So I'm pretty fierce, but truthfully, about the secession. But so are you. So we in the end, these are minor, differences, because we're Lincoln people. Now, here's what I want you, because we're going to have to take questions soon enough. I want you to talk about what actually are different ways of thinking about this famous phrase that's at the core of the story, according to Lincoln, the reconstructed story, the Gettysburg Address story. All men are created. Maybe he means it to mean something slightly different than what Jefferson did. And the one additional complication that I've added in the new book is it wasn't just Jefferson. You see, he didn't dine alone in 1776. Ben Franklin was there, and John Adams was there. And even in 1776, I think they understand all men are created equal in a slightly different way than Jefferson does. So I say, it has different meanings in 1776. There's a southern meaning and there's a northern meaning and differences. And immediately the North is going to use these words to end slavery, and the South is going to double down on slavery. And then Lincoln comes along and we eventually get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But that's my take. How do you tell the story?
Okay, so what does all men are created equal mean? Hugely important question. And it's had a great impact on our history? The short answer is it can mean lots of different things. So the language is susceptible to lots of different interpretations. And then I sort of believe that the meaning of this phrase is the way that it's used. It's what we take it to mean. So if you ask people nowadays, what does all men are created equal mean? And they agree on that, then that's what it means. Or you could say that's what it means to us. And nowadays, I think we've got a pretty stable consensus that it means something like all people should be equal before the law. The government should treat all people equally. The government should treat all people with equal concern and respect, something like that. We should have equal rights under law. So it's about the way that the government should treat people in society. Now that, I think, is absolutely not what it meant to Jefferson and his contemporaries in 1776. What did it mean to them? It meant something about the source of legitimate political authority. Because think back to the context of the Declaration of Independence. What is it about? It is, as the title tells you, a Declaration of Independence. It's not a declaration of rights. It's not a declaration of moral sentiments. It is intending to establish that the colonies are declaring their independence and that they're justified in doing so. And what does it need to do to justify this Declaration of Independence? It needs to explain when political authority that was legitimate, so at one point the British Crown had a legitimate claim to obedience from the colonists. It needs to explain how political authority that was legitimate can cease to be legitimate, so that now the colonists are justified in rejecting the authority of the British Crown and dissolving the bonds that connect them. So in order to come up with that account, you need a theory of where legitimate political authority comes from. And that's what the preamble of the Declaration gives you. So one answer might be it comes from God. God just chooses some people to rule over others. And if that's the case, and the British monarch, they did used to style themselves king by the grace of God, they used to appeal to the divine right of kings, but they're not appealing to it anymore in 1776. After the Glorious Revolution, the divine right of kings is a little bit of a marginal argument. So Jefferson does have to address it, but maybe not spend a huge amount of time on it. And he dispatches it with this one phrase, all men are created equal, which would have been understood by educated people in 1776 as a shorthand invocation of Enlightenment social contract theory, and probably in particular the social contract theory of John Locke. And what it means is, in a world with no government and no laws, so the way that Enlightenment social contract theory typically goes about figuring out what makes political authority legitimate is they say, well, imagine a world with no government and no laws where people just exist. Where does authority come from? And the starting point for Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau and all of these Enlightenment social contract thinkers is that in this hypothetical world with no government and no laws, this state of nature, if people just popped into existence, if they were created, as the Declaration says, no one would have an obligation to obey anyone else, which is to say there is no such thing as the divine right of kings. And that's what it means to say all men are created equal. It means legitimate political authority is not bestowed by God, it comes from somewhere else. And then the Declaration goes on immediately to tell you where it comes from. So people in the state of nature have their natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or property, if you follow Locke more closely. But these rights are not secure because other people might come along and violate your rights in the state of nature. And so people form a society, and then they form a government, and the point of the government is to protect them from other people. So government comes into being through consent as sort of a mutual self-defense pact. And that's what it's necessary for all men are created equal to mean for the argument of the Declaration to work. And that's all that it's necessary for it to mean. Now, you might think, well, at the time, people must have understood that it had some broad moral significance the way that we do now, and that it was inconsistent with slavery, for instance. But the evidence is pretty strongly against that. And I'll just explain quickly why I think that. So if Jefferson had been writing a novel, broad moral principle that was inconsistent with slavery, it would have been surprising. People would have paid a lot of attention to it. People would have thought it's very significant to say all men are created equal. But they didn't. The audience of the Declaration didn't think that the preamble was particularly significant, and they didn't think that the phrase all men are created equal was particularly significant. This comes later, and it comes from abolitionists, really. Abolitionists start reading it differently. And then sort of the most direct evidence for this, how do we know that Jefferson didn't write all men are created equal and thereby criticize slavery? Because we know what would have happened if Jefferson had written a passage of the Declaration of Independence that criticized slavery, because he did in an earlier draft. And again, I do take your point, it's not just Jefferson. But there is, in an earlier draft of the Declaration of Independence, a passage that criticizes King George for the Atlantic slave trade, which is somewhat different from slavery in America, but it still hits too close to home for the Continental Congress, and they take it out. So the historical evidence, both in terms of the drafting process and the reception of the Declaration, suggests that people understood it in this very limited sense. And then there's actually a lot more to say about different understandings and similar documents, and there's the Virginia Declaration of Rights compared to the Massachusetts Constitution. But I see that we're moving on to the questions. So
let me just tell you one thing about, or two things about that, and then questions. I said, it's not just which war and which text and which propositions, but it's which heroes. And Kim has absolutely persuaded me that I have to break up with Thomas Jefferson. When I was in college, if you had met me, I would have told you. I told people, if I'm ever lucky enough to have a son and my spouse agrees, I'd like to name him Thomas Jefferson Amar. And I've changed my mind completely. The point isn't Sally Hemings, because the older I get, the more I realize, truthfully, sex is complicated and relationships of that sort are complicated. So put Sally Hemings to one side. Jefferson he's lost his wife. I think on her deathbed, he promised, whether she asked him or not, never to marry again. Sally is actually his dead wife's half-sister. And it's complicated, so put that aside. The point is, and Kim helped me see it more than anyone, forget Sally. They're children. Thomas Jefferson is enslaving his own children and never acknowledging them. Ooh, 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 ooh. How can that person be on Mount Rushmore and at the center of a story that we all come together about? So you really did persuade me of this, and I wrote a piece on July 4th for the National Review saying I'm breaking up with Jefferson. But that doesn't mean that I'm breaking up with all the founders. Lincoln is to me still preeminent. Washington does free his slaves on his deathbed, and that's important. But from the beginning, and this is the story I'm telling more in the new book, Adams and Franklin, who are there right next to Jefferson. Jefferson's the only major slaveholder of the five who draft on the drafting committee. They interpret the same phrase rather differently than do the Virginians. And Franklin's a Pennsylvanian, and Pennsylvania will adopt its own constitution in 1776, within a month of the Declaration of Independence, that says everyone is born free and equal, and they use that immediately to abolish slavery. And Adams in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which is John and Sam Adams together, say all men are born free and equal, and that will immediately lead to abolition in Massachusetts. The Quock Walker case, Holmes versus Jennison, 1783-84. So from the beginning, I say it's a kind of it's a bad marriage, truthfully, in which the two sides, North and South, don't quite understand each other. They're saying the same words, but they have very different understandings. And Virginia's hedging, and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts are using the very same words, you see, to adopt immediate emancipation. The ancient world had slavery everywhere, and have the idea of freeing individual slaves. You know, Ben-Hur, or a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, or the New Testament. It's everywhere. But the ancient world did not have the idea of ending slavery. They had ideas of manumission or emancipation, but not of abolition. No one proposed ending slavery. That was born, I believe, in America, in Philadelphia, in fact, the world's first anti-slavery society, abolitionist society, 1775, 76. Franklin's going to be the president of this organization. Benjamin Rush, who signs the Declaration, is. So from the beginning, these people who are signing the Declaration have kind of different understandings. So breaking up for me with Jefferson doesn't mean even breaking up with the Declaration or the founders or the Constitution. But you've absolutely persuaded me that I have to take down all my portraits of Thomas Jefferson. So we have questions. And part of it, Tim, because you and I are both, we talk about founding fathers, we're talking about fathers. You and I are both fathers. And can you imagine someone who enslaves his own children? How can that person be the center of America's story?
Yeah.
So anyway, we're going to take your questions, and so who's going to start? And the one suggestion is that your question be in the form of a question. If this were that it end with a question mark. Oh, and if it were crisp, that would be even better, because we can get to more of them.
For Kermit? This
Yes.
is kind of a gimme, but we've had one constitutional scholar that has become president in this century, and he did a pretty good job. Would you ever consider running for the job?
Well, thank you for the question. That's flattering. No, I would not. I think.
I would vote for you.
Thank you.
And I have 4 students. I have four students who are senators of the United States: Cory Booker, Chris Coons, Michael Bennett, and Josh Hawley. Jake Sullivan is, my former. I would vote for you, Kim, absolutely. But I respectfully disagree. If you meant Woodrow Wilson, he's not a good guy. Actually, wait till the last. I haven't written that chapter. That's going to be in June, because I got to finish it by July 4th. But Woodrow Wilson brings back segregation to D.C. He's a total secessionist. He pretends he's some New Jersey guy, but he's totally secession all the way through. Virginia and Georgia, not such a great guy in my view.
Oh yeah, that's redemption.
And Teddy doesn't love Woodrow so much, I don't think.
No, he doesn't. Teddy was better.
Yes.
Definitely.
And honestly, Taft was conservative, but not bad. Teddy loved him and then kind of turned on him. That's a complicated story, I think.
It is.
Was Wilson the one you were invoking as the constitutional scholar?
No. Obama.
Oh, this century. Okay, this century. My bad. Okay.
Oh,
yes.
right. I keep forgetting which century. Yeah.
Right. See, we're so old. Okay.
As you get older.
But look, here's the point. Whether you're aware of it or not, there is an American story. It's a national narrative. And if you don't know it, Aaron said, he talked about, the right to participate, but he also talked about the desire. That's really important. And it's not just about rights, it's about responsibilities. We're the hiring committee for the presidency every 4 years. How can you do that if you don't know who were the good presidents and not, if you basically don't know the story, okay? So here's actually what that election of 2008 is all about. There's this one guy, and he says, well, I'm a tall, skinny, constitutional lawyer, and I can give a good speech, and I'm a racial unifier. My name is Barack Obama, okay? And the other guy says, I dedicated my life to military service, to serving, the rest of us. I'm a total military hero. I'm George Washington. I'm John McCain. Okay, and so, and you see, I'm not a Trump person in part because he doesn't fit the narrative at all, the story. No person who ever sought the presidency before had zero track record of public service, you see. But if you didn't know that story, that fact, damn it, you're not paying attention. Read some books. I've got some suggestions for you, okay? Because you're the hiring committee, and if you're trying to draft, the quarterback or something, you need to know who was a good quarterback and who wasn't. You need to actually, because we're the committee, and if we don't know the story. So Obama actually is conjuring up memories of Lincoln for those of us who know the story, and John McCain is conjuring up memories of George Washington, who does put country first. And if you come by afterwards, I'll tell you why I actually think Obama was closer to Lincoln than McCain was to Washington, because they actually had different positions within the military. But I can tell you who was very close to Washington. His name is Ulysses S. Grant, and his name is Dwight Eisenhower. We've had 6 terms of George Washington. Supreme Allied commanders above party who could have been elected by the right or the left. That's George Washington. That's Ulysses Simpson, Unconditional Surrender, U.S. Grant. That's Dwight Eisenhower, which is why Ron Chernow, you see, writes a biography of Washington and then writes a biography of Grant, you see, and also Hamilton, too. He's one of the dedicatees of the book, as is Lin Miranda. But if you don't know that story, and McCain is more like Hamilton, than he is like Washington, and that's, very high praise, but you can't do your job, because that's the only thing we have in common, you see, is our history as Americans, our heroes, our stories, our texts.
Thank you both for being here. You speak of slavery and how we chose to abolish it. And if my understanding is correct about the Electoral College, was meant to perhaps protect slave owners, but maybe I'm wrong. Why do we not abolish it now?
You want me to jump in on that one, Kim, or you want to go first?
I'll go first, but I think that we agree on this. So I think that you're right, what you say about the origins of the Electoral College. So as I understand it, the Electoral College has basically 3 original justifications for it. One is a concern about low information voters. So there's a fear that people, if you were to use a national popular vote, people would be familiar with their regional candidates, but maybe not candidates from other regions, so that people in New England will know the New England candidates, but not the Virginian or Deep South candidates. But that the local notables, who will be the electors, are actually going to have the information that's required to know all of the candidates and make an educated decision. And then there's a concern about pressure on states to expand the franchise. So if you do a national popular vote and Virginia wants to get a Virginian elected, how could they do that? They could try to increase the number of Virginians voting. And if you let the states set the voting qualifications, which the Constitution generally does, or you say, as the provision in the Constitution that determines who can vote for representatives does, that if you can vote for, say, the state governor, you could vote for president, then Virginia can get twice the number of Virginians voting if it lets women vote. So there's this pressure, a competitive pressure on states to expand the franchise. And then third, there's the question, what do you do about enslaved people? And if you use the Electoral College the way we have it, it incorporates the 3/5 compromise. So the number of electors that a state gets is their number of senators, which for every state is 2, and then the number of representatives. And the number of representatives is determined by the free population and then 3/5 of the enslaved population. So the Electoral College did enhance the power of the slaveholding states. So none of those is a good reason now. Why do we still have it? Because it's in the Constitution, and the Constitution is hard to change. However, it's possible that we could work around that with the National Popular Vote Compact, because being sophisticated, politically aware Americans, you probably all know this, but you have no right to vote for president. The state determines, the state legislature determines how its electors are awarded. And they could say, we're not going to have a popular election at all. Or they could say, we'll have a popular election, but the candidate who gets all of our electors is whoever wins the national popular vote. And if enough states agree to do this, they could effectively give us an end run around the Electoral College. So the idea, and it's out there and states are signing on, it's an interstate compact, is you get enough states to determine the election to sign on, so a majority of the Electoral College, and then it kicks in, and then all of the states that have pledged to award their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote will do that, and that person will win. And I support that. And actually, I did an event for the League of Women Voters where the point was to increase awareness of and endorse the National Popular Vote Compact. So probably Akhil and I are not the only people here who support that.
So I feel like I've died and gone to heaven because this is amazing. But truthfully, it's a little complicated because I'm not sure I agree with everything that I used to say about this. But just in a nutshell, when I was young, people said, oh, the Electoral College was balanced between big and small states. Raise your hand if that's what you were taught. Well, how come the big state guy wins every time? See, that's not right. You know, for 32 of the first 36 years, it's Virginia, which is the biggest state. We've only had 4 small state presidents in all of American history, and one is Biden, which we didn't have before, and the other is Clinton and Zachary Taylor and Franklin Pierce, and that's it. So it's not a balance between big and small states. That's House versus Senate. Oh, we have it because they didn't believe in democracy. Raise your hand if you heard that. Well, they put the Constitution to a vote, and they believed in direct election of members of the House and direct elections of governors, so those were baloney reasons. And so when I was a young person, I wrote the first op-ed in the New York Times saying it was all about slavery. That's what it was about. And now, you know, a very well-educated audience, people, you know, are getting that. So that's great. That's right. It was all about slavery. So thank you for that. That was wonderful. And then I said, well, if it's all about slavery, maybe why should we have it? And so I sit in the bathtub one day. This is my Archimedes moment. And I actually, this is a true story. I did the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And I posted on the internet. And I said, wow, this is a kind of interesting idea. A little screwy, but, you know, and now people are talking about it. So that's amazing. I'm not sure it's actually the best idea, truthfully, because it's got some, and if you look it up, National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, I promise you, Wikipedia will say, also known as the Amar Plan. And here are the couple of the glitches, just so you see them. One is change the rules, change the game. There are going to be unintended, unforeseen consequences, and it might be worse. And you say, well, what are the unforeseen consequences? And it's like, I wish I know. The problem with unforeseen consequences is they're unforeseen, and, you know, and I was just sitting in the bathtub, but maybe it's possible that, you know, the smart guy sitting in the bathtub is going to, you know, not see everything, and maybe the devil, this is just a Burkean point, inertia. The devil you know is better than, but the other argument really is, do you trust a national government to run a national election? Think about how much more pressure Donald Trump could put on people in Georgia and all the rest if it's a national election rather than run. So there are some complexities here. Who's going to count the votes? How are we going to do it? But that's the conversation that we need to have, because he's right. The Constitution, and I tried to say this early on too, is way more about slavery than we were taught. We have to come to grips with that basic fact about our story and then figure out how we go forward with that. So that's an amazing question. Thank you for that. I think we're supposed to alternate.
Hi. I don't know anything about this, but I presume you two know more about it. We've talked about the use of the different interpretations of all men are created equal. Jefferson, Lincoln, the Pennsylvania State Constitution folks, et cetera. I imagine the women and some men who supported the suffragette movement, getting in the late 19th, 20th, early 20th century, did yet another take on this idea of, well, all men are created equal, to expand it to all are created equal. A, thoughts on that, and B, in your knowledge, have there been other groups who have done yet another take on this idea of all men are created equal that was different from Jefferson and Lincoln and the suffragettes?
Could I jump in on that, Kim? But why don't you go first?
Sure. Okay. So when people are talking about the Declaration of Independence and the phrase all men are created equal, who does this apply to? Who does it guarantee rights to, and what rights does it guarantee? My general take on this is it means everyone. So, in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, in the Dred Scott decision, defenders of slavery are saying, no, it doesn't include black people. And I'm saying, of course it includes black people. What do you think all men means? Roger Taney would have you believe that all men means all British subjects. Well, what a weird way to say all British subjects, right? All men seems like it means all men. And furthermore, I think it's pretty clear that it means all people also. It used to be more common to say men or man to mean humanity, to mean all people. And I'm pretty confident that that's what they meant at the time. And Danielle Allen, in her book, Our Declaration, talks about this and how she used to read all men are created equal and think that it was excluding women. But then she read this earlier draft of the Declaration of Independence where the language, and I guess I won't attribute it solely to Jefferson again, but where the draft of the Declaration is criticizing King George for the international slave trade and says how terrible it is that he has created a market where men are bought and sold. And she's like, oh, there they are in the Declaration using men, and yet they clearly mean all people, because it's not just men bought and sold, it's women, it's children, it's everyone. And so we can read men to be inclusive, and I think that's true. I think it means all people. Where I part company with the conventional wisdom, or sort of the inspiring progressive reading the Declaration is, as I was explaining, I think created equal means very little. I think created equal is what John C. Calhoun called a hypothetical truism. I think it's just this idea that in the state of nature, if there's no government, no laws, no one has a duty to obey. It means very little for real people in the real world. And the key difference, I think, and maybe Akhil would agree with this, is whether you say created or born, really. So if you say all men or all people are born free and equal, then it sounds like you're talking about real people. And if you look at the contemporaneous documents, there is actually a pattern that the northern states are more likely to say born, and that language is, as Akhil said, used and understood to abolish slavery, because you've got people born into slavery in Massachusetts saying, wait a second, I'm born free and equal. What made me a slave? How was I made a slave consistent with the Massachusetts Constitution? And Quock Walker, in his freedom suit, invokes the Massachusetts Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, but the court doesn't pay attention to the Declaration. And now maybe there are reasons that it doesn't have legal force in Massachusetts, but they do end up relying on the document that says born. And then it's sort of telling, if you really wanted to say something that condemned slavery using this kind of born equal language, you could say men are born and remain free and equal in rights. And then you would be really clear that you're talking about real people and not just at the moment of birth, and not just before governments are created, but they remain equal, they still have equal rights in society. And if you wanted to write a declaration that was inconsistent with slavery, that's what you would say. And Thomas Jefferson participated in the drafting of that declaration too, because it's the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And it was understood to abolish slavery, although they later reinstated it. So I feel that there are different ways of phrasing it that make the argument against slavery easier or harder. And the Declaration of Independence actually takes the harder route, the route that has less conflict with slavery.
And now you know why the sequel book that I have to finish on July 4th, I'm about 2/3 of the way done, is entitled Born Equal. That's the title, and it's 1840 to 1920, and it's all about ending slavery and black equality, but it's also about women's suffrage and women's equality. And it's not just late 19th and 20th century, it's Seneca Falls. The title of chapter 3 is actually Seneca Falls, which is a total riff on the Declaration of Independence, called the Declaration of Sentiments. And it's word for word the Declaration with just these things plugged in, and very famously says, all men and women are created equal, and that's 1848, Seneca Falls. I'm just going to, now on the Declaration, just one thing. What they're saying is, actually, they're different readings, of course, but one is that humans are actually different than tameable beasts of the field. If I find a rabbit, I can actually reduce that rabbit to my possession. I wouldn't, because but I could eat the rabbit. I could kill the rabbit. I could kill the deer, okay? I could tame beasts of the field, and humans aren't like that. They're not tameable beasts of the field, and so there are rights, but there are also responsibilities. So on the northern reading, all men are created equal means I would be violating someone who's in the image of God, who's a human and not a horse or a cow or a pig or a rabbit, if I reduce that human to slavery, and that would be female as well as male. So they're different readings of all this, the northern versus the southern. Because I'm seeing a lot of women here, and this is the League of Women Voters, I just want to read you, just because I'm excited. Here's actually the first paragraph of the new book, and because it's all about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, because the last book had way too many men in it. So here's actually the first paragraph, and it's about a wedding, and women are into weddings, if you're like a Jane Austen person or something. So I'm a Jane Austen person. In the spring of 1840, without the slightest preparation for a wedding or a voyage, 24-year-old Elizabeth Cady determined to take the fateful step. On May 1, she and Henry Brewster Stanton, 10 years her senior, exchanged vows. The officiating clergyman in upstate New York fretted about performing the marriage on a Friday, considered back then an unlucky day for a wedding. Recollecting the event many decades later, Elizabeth laughed. She and Henry had, quote, lived together without more than the usual matrimonial friction, I love that line, for nearly half a century, and had produced 7 children, all of one of whom are still living, unquote. Young Elizabeth did not want to wait until Saturday. Henry needed to set sail for London soon, and she aimed to join him then and forevermore. Last sentence. Elizabeth also insisted on something else. The minister had to omit the traditional word obey in the vows. Quote, I obstinately refused to obey one with whom I supposed I was entering into an equal relation. So that's the first paragraph. All men, and the Declaration of Sentiments, Seneca Falls, 1848, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass is there too, James Mott, all men and women are created equal.
I just wanted to say, I think with your proposition about the Gettysburg Address, I like very much because it uses the word conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition. Those are abstractions. Conception is not birth. And I'm not in Alabama and I'm not from there. But conceived and dedicated are idealistic words, and they talk about what was meant to Lincoln at the time Lincoln lived, as well as what was meant to the brave men living and dead who have gone here before us and hallowed the nation and all of that. So I think he's recognizing that ideas change and that perceptions of what is fair and equal and right change. And here we are a century, almost 2 centuries after that, and our things have changed too. So I think it's really very, very exciting for me to think about your idea that we really belong more to the Gettysburg Address than the preamble to the Constitution. So thank you.
Wonderful question, Mark. Just reminding everyone, and I love it that you know your Gettysburg Address. That's because we're all Americans. We have it in common, and other people are remembering those phrases. It's a burial, and the theme is death and birth and rebirth. And so, bringing forth is actually a birth metaphor, coming out of the land, brought forth, and conceived is, a life metaphor. It ends with, this nation shall have a new birth of freedom. The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It's all about life and death, and the life is not just birth, but rebirth. It's reconstruction. It's a new birth of freedom, which I think Kim and I both very much agree with, right?
Yes, absolutely. So it's a new birth of freedom, and it's different, I think. So I think it's different in one way. I've told you, I think that Lincoln is over-reading all men are created equal. He's taking that to mean something about equality in society rather than just equality in the state of nature. But the other very interesting way in which the Gettysburg Address is different from the Declaration of Independence, which I think we don't appreciate, is the Gettysburg Address is pro-democracy. So government of the people, by the people, for the people, that's a democracy.
Right.
What about the Declaration of Independence?
Created equal isn't about one person, one vote, truthfully.
No.
Right.
No.
But we today read it that way, in
Right.
part because of folks like Lincoln and Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens and the Reconstruction generation.
Right. So what does the Declaration of Independence tell you about legitimate government? What is required for a government to be legitimate? Does it have to be a democracy? No. According to the Declaration of Independence, the government has to be formed by consent, and it has to protect the natural rights of the people who form it. And a monarchy could do that. A hereditary monarchy could do that if there's some consent at some time in the past, and that's really how the British monarchy was justified. And that's why the colonists, and I got this from you, I think, Akhil, that's why the colonists have to then go on and say, here are all the things that George has done wrong.
Yeah.
He's a tyrant.
They don't even
That's why
mention that he's a
illegitimate.
hereditary monarch. Right. No, it's rights violations. I'm seeing some movement back there. How many minutes do we have left? 0?
0?
Oh, we're getting it. Well, that's what they call a hard
Unfortunately,
stop.
yes, we don't want this conversation to end, but unfortunately it has to. So if you would join me in giving applause, this is just an amazing, amazing conversation. Thank you to both Professors Roosevelt and Amar. Now, we're actually going to be bringing them back to sign books, so we hope that you will speak with them back in the lobby of the Berkeley. So Diane's Books is there. If you have not purchased your books yet, she'll be happy to get you one. And we thank you all for coming and look forward to seeing you at our next event. Take care. Bye-bye.